Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we're going to be breaking down the Friday, March 8th slate of college basketball DFS. Now, I am sitting here recording this at 10 o'clock Eastern Time on Thursday night, and as of right now, DraftKings does not have the Friday night slate up yet. However, I do not want to stay up until 2 a.m. waiting, so I'm going to go ahead and record the episode now. I have the full breakdown for the early slate, and hopefully by the time I am done recording, I will be able to add in the night slate very quickly, do the research for the night slate and add in the night slate, because the night slate should have a lot of teams that we're familiar with. And so it should not take as long to do the research for that. And hoping here, I'll be able to add that into the end of the video, and I will put timestamps on the audio as well as the video. So that way, if you were just looking for the Friday night slate, you can get to that very easily. But like I said, the point is to have a breakdown of both slates here on this video. If that does not end up happening, and you want my thoughts on the night slate, there are a few places you can get that. You can join the Fantasy Corner Discord. The link is in the description on YouTube as well as on the audio feed. We've got a lot of smart people in there, play a lot of DFS for a lot of different sports, and college basketball is one of them. The college basketball chat in there has been jumping lately, just talking strategy, talking plays, and we've had a lot of people win some money in there. So, come join us. I'll be in there chopping it up all day long. And, just if you want to bounce any ideas off me, you want my thoughts on some of these plays, join the Discord. That is the best place where you can get that. And I will also have an article for my Patreon. And throughout the entirety of conference tournament season, I'm going to have an article for my Patreon for every college basketball DFS slate where I highlight my core plays as well as kind of my lineup strategy and attack strategy for the slate. Now that does come with a little bit of a charge. The Discord is entirely free. The Patreon is a little bit of an expense, $3 a month, but I do think that I do provide very valuable information and can help you get better at college basketball DFS by reading those articles. All right, so that's where we stand right now. One more announcement to make before we get started, though. My plan is to have our first live show tomorrow night at 10:30 Eastern Time as we talk about the early Saturday slate. So that's the plan as of right now. So make sure you're subscribed on YouTube so that way you can join us. If you are not already subscribed on YouTube, go ahead and do that. That way you can be notified when we go live, and follow me on Twitter also, because if anything needs to change with that timing, I am going to announce it on Twitter as well as obviously on the live on YouTube. So, that's the plan as of right now. That should give me enough time that I can put my daughter down at 9:30 like she does just about every night, and then have enough time to research the slate, what I need to get done, and then go live at 10:30 Eastern Time. So that is the plan. So make sure you are here for that. You don't want to miss it. So with that being said, let's go ahead and end the intro there. Let's go ahead and start breaking down this early slate. We got 5 games, I don't even know if you can call them mid-majors. They're mostly small major teams, but 5 mid-major to small major games where we should have a lot of interesting options for building DFS lineups. Let's go ahead and dive in and break it down. All right, so remember with this early slate, this is a lot of small major to mid-major teams, so the injury reporting is going to be scarce, and with the way DraftKings sets up start times, it's going to be very hard to late swap off of guys. And there's a few guys that I'm going to identify on here that I believe are truly mispriced, but nothing is a sure thing. If you played the Thursday slate and you played Ojiako of Coastal Carolina, he looked like an absolute smash play at 4,900 when he should have been like 7,900. And then, oh, by the way, he's a late scratch and you don't have time to late swap him out. And nothing was announced before the game. And he ends up getting a big fat goose egg for about 60 to 70% of the field, depending on what tournament you were playing in. So just know that nothing is certain here on this slate. You are absolutely playing, what's the right word here? Loose isn't quite the right word, but like, this is not a slate where if you are very conservative, if you are very tight with your money, this is not a slate where I would advise you to put a lot of money down on, because kooky things are going to happen with some of these teams where we don't really know a whole lot about their guys. We don't really know a whole lot about the injury reporting. And I'll be honest, there's not a whole lot of teams on this slate that I have sat down and watched full games of this season. I have done my best to do the research with the data and everything that I have, but I don't have the extensive experience watching these teams like I would with a lot of Big 12 teams or a lot of ACC teams. But we're gonna do our best to break it down here. So let's go ahead and kick it off with game number 1. This is Radford taking on High Point, and this is actually a local game for me. High Point University is about 20 minutes from my house. I have watched them a little bit this season. I know a little bit about them because I do have some some friends and some family friends that went to High Point and have a little bit of interest in this game. Fun fact, this conference tournament is actually being played at High Point's arena. So this is pretty much a home game for High Point taking on Radford. KenPom has this game projected to be 82-72 in favor of High Point, but I don't even think it's going to be that close, especially considering it's a High Point home game, because High Point won the previous meetings 85-71 and 99-74. So a lot of scoring in both those games, and even on both sides, because Radford was able to get to 70 points both times. Now on the Radford side, actually, let's start off with High Point, the team that is projected to score more points. So High Point really plays a short rotation, which is really good for DFS. They only play 6 guys double-digit minutes in most games. You have things like senior night, foul trouble, and overtime games that mess with that, but they only want to play 6 guys double-digit minutes. Their starting 5 is Miles, Thiem, Benham, Hamilton, and Bodo, with Gifa coming off the bench as the big reserve. And then Dazuba, Sarjunas, and Hines will play sparingly. Not much, but like they'll get in, especially if somebody's in foul trouble or if you get overtime or something like that, they will get to play. So with this High Point team, High Point is a great rebounding team. Radford is not. Radford ranks 330th in the nation at offensive rebounding rate given up defensively, and High Point ranks 16th in the nation at offensive rebounding. So I want to target the High Point guys in this one. That includes Kamani Hamilton, who the last time they played Radford had 48 fantasy points. And then that also includes Juslin Bodo, who does not have an accurate game log on DraftKings. He does average about 8 rebounds a game, though. So I think he's a little bit of a misprice at 4,500. And in the last game that he played against Radford, it's not in his game log, but he only needed 18 minutes to put up 8 points and 12 boards. And so at 4,500, with a team that is good at rebounding versus a team who is not good at rebounding, I think this is a really good spot for Bodo. He is one of my favorite value plays on the slate, and I would prefer to target this High Point team through those 2 bigs, Hamilton and Bodo. Miles, Thiem, Gifa, and Benham, I think serve primarily as game stacking or team stacking options. Miles is probably their best player that's not Kamani Hamilton, most dependent player that's not Kamani Hamilton. He's had 30 fantasy points in 3 straight games. He would probably get the most of my consideration out of anybody else. Now, the Radford side is interesting. So Radford only played 6 guys in double-digit minutes in the first round of the Big South tournament. The good news is we have 1 game sample size to go off of for them. Their starting 5 is Giles, Smith, Antoine, Archer, and Harris, with Chandler Turner being the guy that comes in and plays off the bench. Now, Kenyon Giles and Daquan Smith are their 2 leaders in usage rate and shot rate, and the stats do bear that out. Smith is slightly worse in peripherals. He is a little bit more shot dependent than Kenyon Giles is. That's why Giles is priced up a little bit higher, in my opinion. But both those 2 guys, if Radford is to keep this game close, I would see those 2 being the guys who are scoring a lot to keep it close. Archer is coming off of his ceiling game. He put up a season high 46 fantasy points against USC Upstate with 21 and 14. And I think that's the reason why he's priced up so much. If he were about 5,500 instead of 7,500, I'd be all over him. But at 7,500, I'm kind of out. And I kind of think that you're going to get a better points per minute play out of Josiah Harris or Chandler Turner, because those are typically guys with equal rates as Archer. Archer's just coming off the ceiling game. Next up, game number 2, we have Missouri State taking on Indiana State. This one is projected to be Indiana State 81-72. Indiana State won both meetings this season 88-66 and 73-71, so 2 totally different types of games. Now, for Missouri State, we've actually seen them play a game. They were on the early slate on DraftKings on Thursday. Got to watch a lot of that game during my lunch break at school. You guys that have been long-term followers of the show know that I am a high school math teacher and coach. So I got to watch a lot of that game during my lunch break, but not not the whole game or anything like that. But the good news is we have a little bit of a sample size for Missouri State to speak on. So for Missouri State, I do not understand the price on Alston Mason. He is their usage leader on the season. He was great against Murray State, in my opinion, put up 34.5 fantasy points in 31 minutes. And in the 2 games against Indiana State, he was pretty good. He had 30 fantasy points and 28 fantasy points. I think he's one of the slate's supreme misprices, and I think he's an elite cash game option who does have GPP viability because of the price tag that he is at. NJ Benson is Missouri State's primary big man. He played 32 minutes against Murray State, which he doesn't always do. But their other big man, Cesare Edwards, was in big time foul trouble. And in that game, NJ Benson put up a double double, 10 and 12. And he's been pretty successful against Indiana State. He did have 25 and 31 fantasy points against Indiana State. What's interesting about the Sycamores is they don't pursue the offensive glass. Like they just don't even try to get offensive rebounds. So you could see defensive rebounders like Donovan Clay, like NJ Benson, like a little bit of Mason and more. You could see these, rebounders for Missouri State have a decent game because, the defensive rebounds are going to be there for them. Now, it's also worth monitoring that Damian Mayo left Thursday's game early. I was not privy to see if he returned in this game. I could not find anything on social media that indicated he returned to the game on Thursday. So if he does in fact miss time, what you would see is boosted minutes for Ayers, Moore, and Lee. I would be most partial to Chance Moore. He is the one of them who actually has a decent usage rate, and he's a very solid rebounding guard. So he would probably be the guy that I think would be the biggest beneficiary from a fantasy perspective if Damian Mayo is in fact out for this game. But it's very likely that we won't know that information until before or right before or after tip. Now, on the Indiana State side, they essentially play a six-man rotation. Their starting five in order of their usage rates is Robbie Avila, Isaiah Swope, Ryan Conwell, excuse me, and then Julian Larry and Jason Kent. That is their starting five in order of usage rate. Xavier Bledson is the guy that will primarily come off the bench, and Jake Wolf will get minutes every now and then, but he's really not super involved. So on this Indiana State team, we all know about Robbie Avila now. He's gone viral on social media. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, they call him, or Rob Wave, as he likes to be called. But he is basically like if you took Nikola Jokic, made him Hispanic, threw goggles on him, and put him in the Missouri Valley. That's Robbie Avila, right? He is a super finesse big man who is very impressive in his footwork and fundamentals. I enjoy watching him play. He's an elite fantasy option, and I think on a slate like this, where he is like the name recognition on this slate, he is going to be a big-time popular play in DFS. My one word of caution is that he did struggle against Missouri State in their second meeting. He only put up 22 fantasy points in that game on 3 for 11 shooting, but the first time they played, he was 9 for 15 and put up 49 fantasy points. So big range of outcomes for Robbie Avila, but I guarantee you he's going to be pretty high owned because everybody knows who he is. Now, there are two guards after that. Ryan Conwell is a very efficiency-based guy. He generally shoots a high percentage. He has had some ceiling games, but he really relies on being efficient. And so if he gets an off shooting night, you're not going to get a whole lot of fantasy production. Isaiah Swope tends to get more volume. He has a higher usage rate. It hasn't been there lately for him, but previous games against Missouri State, he had 30 fantasy points. In the first one, he had 14 fantasy points, but he did get a ton of shots in both of those games, 14 and 19 shots in those two games. So definitely a guy I have interest in because of the volume is Isaiah Swope. Jason Kent is going to be a super popular value play just because you look at the game log and you look at what he's done, and it just, the price tag doesn't quite make sense. He has dual eligibility. The usage rate isn't super high, but he can get you a lot of peripheral stats and he can be efficient from the field. I don't mind him at 5,800, but he's not my favorite play or anything like that. The next game up is going to be William and Mary taking on North Carolina A&T, and this one is the one that probably is the most suspect to target, in my opinion. More on that in a second. KenPom has this game projected to be 73-70 in favor of William and Mary. The previous meeting between these two teams was 76-69 in favor of North Carolina A&T. However, there is a big concern with North Carolina A&T. Their best player, by far their best player, Landon Glasper, missed the last game of the regular season that they played, and they're going to be in trouble if they don't have him. Like, he is, one of the best scorers in the Colonial Athletic. Is it the Colonial? It's the Coastal Athletic now. It's still the CAA. He's one of the best scorers in the Coastal Athletic. He is by far their best player and their leader in usage rate, and I think he's at a very affordable price tag. But unless I can find some beat reporter or somebody out there that says he's playing, I'm not going to touch him. And he's going to definitely have a big time impact on how the rest of this NCAA team plays. In the last game that they played without Glasper in the lineup, what they did was they only played 6 guys total, and all 6 of them played more than 25 minutes. Camion Shell ran the point with Mackay, Duke, Joyner, and Chidicutis is the rest of the starting 5, with Kelman Nicholas coming off the bench. Duke is listed as out on DraftKings, but he did in fact play in that last game against Campbell, played 30 minutes, put up 18 fantasy points. He's only $3,900. I think he's one of the better values of the slate. But what you saw in terms of usage was Shell and Mackay really ran the show. Camion Shell is a guy that I coached against when he was in high school. He was a really shifty high school quarterback and a really smooth ball handling guard at his high school. He was honestly like a guy that you were happy to see graduate, but you respected because you knew like he did things the right way, and I liked the kid. So really happy to see him have some success at A&T. But he was a big time success, in that Campbell game, had 37 fantasy points, saw his usage uptake big time with Glasper out. And then Mackay is the same deal. Jalal Mackay in that Campbell game played 38 minutes, took 18 shots, and put up 33 fantasy points. So if we do get word that Glasper is out, Shell and Mackay immediately become great plays. But the problem is that they're already priced up from that great performance they had in their last game. And I'm not really interested if we like get news that Glasper is in, or if we're very murky on that, because they're priced up a little bit more than what they should be if Glasper was in fact playing. Now Chitakudis is their big man, and he put up 24 fantasy points in 35 minutes against Campbell. I don't think he's a terrible option, only 5,800. He's going to play a ton of minutes, as is the same way with Kelman Nicholas. Played 25 minutes, not a high usage player, but definitely an option. But if they're playing this super short rotation without Glasper. Now, on the William and Mary side, they could very well boat race A&T if they're playing without Glasper. In the first meeting, Chase Lowe, it was the big-time performer. He had 37 fantasy points in that game. He is their usage leader on the season. He is a double-double threat. He doesn't always take the most shots in the world, but he generally takes enough to hit value. 8,600 is a pretty lofty price tag, but he does have multiple 40 fantasy point performances in this season on him. I do think he's a little bit priced up because he is coming off of a ceiling game against Hampton, but if they end up, if A&T's playing without Glasper, there's a chance that some of these William and Mary guys absolutely go off. Trey Moss would be another guy that could do that. He actually leads the team in shot rate and leads the team in shot attempts on the season. And he had 30 fantasy points in that first game against North Carolina A&T. Price adjusted, I think he is just as good of a play as Lowe, even though from a pure fantasy point perspective, Lowe probably does end up outscoring him. Now, they also have two Dorseys on this team. The better one is Gabe Dorsey. He plays at a higher usage rate. He gets dual eligibility. He's taken at least 11 shots in the last 3 games, put up 25 fantasy points or more in the last 3 games. I think he's a pretty solid play at an even 7,000. And I got to be honest, I'm really not that interested in the rest of this William and Mary team because so much of their usage is concentrated around those big 3. After that, we've got Longwood taking on Winthrop. The second game in the Big South tournament, Ken Palm has this one projected to be 73-72 in favor of Winthrop. Now, this game was a season split. They split their 2 meetings. Each team won on their home court. Longwood won 84-74, and Winthrop won 68-60. So a big contrast in game environments. This one is played on a neutral floor in High Point. So for Longwood, I'll be honest, this is a team that I thought was going to do better in the Big South this year. I watched them play Dayton right around Christmas, and I was pretty impressed with them. I thought they would be one of the top teams in the Big South, and they ended up as the 5 seed, but they actually beat the number 1 seed High Point in their most recent game to end the regular season. Wallen Napper is their best player. He's taken at least 14 shots in the last 4 games. He is their usage leader. He is their assist leader, and he's put up at least 26 fantasy points in the last 4 games. Regardless of the game environment, I think he's a really solid play, and I think he's an elite cash game option because of the floor that he gives you. Now, the rest of their starting 5 in order of usage goes Christmas, Tucker, Houston, and Granlund. And then Massey and Zapala are 2 guys that will play off the bench. But I'll warn you with Massey and Zapala, both of them play with incredibly high usage rates, but both of them play incredibly inconsistent minute totals, and both of them can be incredibly unpredictable with whether or not their shots actually fall in. So just know that those are 2 boomer bust plays at 5,100 and 4,600 that if you're playing GPPs, I definitely don't mind taking a stab at. Now, I do like Christmas. Not only as a holiday, but on this slate, he has not been that productive recently, but you look over the course of the season, he's been pretty good. And I'm willing to write off the last 3 games as just kind of off shooting nights because, he did take at least 7 shots in all 3 of those games. In fact, he's taken at least 7 shots in every game since February 1st. So he is going to be out there. He is going to get some shots. Not a bad option at $5,900 in my opinion. And he also had his best game of the season against Longwood. I forgot to mention that part. When they played the second time, it's actually not in his game log on DraftKings. Anyway, just take my word for it. He did have his best fantasy game of the season against Longwood. Now, Houston is interesting because DraftKings does not have his game log correct, but he is the cheapest starter on the entire slate at 3,300. In my opinion, he should be more of a like 48 to 5,200 type of player, but you're getting a starter at a super cheap price tag. I wouldn't say necessarily he's a free square, but he is a guy that you can definitely get at a cheap price that is, more than likely going to pay off his price tag. Now, on the Winthrop side, their starting five in order of usage is Doucet, Talford, Harrison, Johnson, and Amumba. I'm not gonna lie, my favorite of the group is kind of Amumba. He has come into the starting lineup recently and really upped his usage rate. He's been over an 18% usage rate in the last 4 games, and in those last 4 games, he scored 23 fantasy points or more, which we would absolutely be okay with at a salary of 5,800. If I'm being totally honest, the rest of the starting five, like we know they're going to get minutes, but they're really overpriced in my opinion. And with all the values on the slate and all the pay up options on the slate, I don't really feel the need to sit here in the 6K range and play some of these Winthrop guys unless I'm making a GPP lineup where I'm just trying to game stack this game and hope that it goes bonkers, because I feel like they're overpriced and I feel like there's better points per dollar plays elsewhere. One guy on their bench that does have a little bit of my interest is Chase Claxton. He plays inconsistent minutes at best, but in the last 3 games, he's played 20 minutes or more, put up 15 fantasy points or more in the last 3 games, which is not bad at a salary of $4,200. Last game of the early slate is Arch Madness, Belmont taking on Northern Iowa. And Ken Palm has this game projected to be 77 to 76 in favor of Northern Iowa. The previous meeting was a season split between these two. Northern Iowa won 83 to 72, and Belmont won 90 to 70. So both games between these two teams saw at least one team get to 80 points, and they saw at least 150 points scored. That's pretty impressive. So this is definitely a game that you're going to want to target. And with it being the last game of the slate, it definitely kind of incentivizes targeting this game so that way you can get a little bit of a late charge up the leaderboard. Now for Belmont, we got to talk about Malik Dia. So what's interesting with him is that depending on what day you look at KenPom, he might be the Nason's leader in usage rate, or he might not be. He does have the highest rate out of all players who have played enough minutes to be eligible. But if you wait long enough, he might not be eligible because he doesn't play a super consistent minute total. But when he's out there on the floor, he is getting the ball in the post. He is getting plenty of shot attempts, and he is getting plenty of offensive rebounds to go along with him. And so he is a guy that, like MJ said a few years back, the ceiling is the roof, but the only thing that caps his ceiling is the amount of minutes that he plays, because when he's out there, he's just an elite option. You saw that if you played him on Thursday against Valpo, he only needed 20 minutes to get to 43 fantasy points. Now, after that, it's worth noting he does split minutes with Brigham Rogers. So if you were looking to strategically fade Malik Dia and play Brigham Rogers, it would have worked out for you on the Thursday slate. He played 21 minutes against Valpo and put up 29 fantasy points. And so, it might not have worked necessarily to fade Dia, but if your logic was, hey, I'm going to play Brigham Rogers and not play Dia, you got 29 fantasy points out of Brigham Rogers. So, this center position for Belmont between Dia and Rogers is super productive, and I definitely wouldn't have a problem playing either of them at their current salaries. Now, after that, Gillespie, Tyson, Willingham, and Davidson are the rest of their starters in terms of usage rate. Now, Tyson has been their best player against Belmont this season. Against Northern Iowa this season. He has led them in scoring in both games against Northern Iowa, had 41 fantasy points against them in January. So he is definitely a guy to look at for that reason, that the fact that, they continually go back to him in this game against this same opponent. And then Gillespie is their second usage leader on the season behind Dia. Didn't get to play a full minute load against Valpo, but 22 fantasy points in 18 minutes is a rate that I would be okay with. But the problem is they priced him up a little bit to 8,900 to make him a little less attractive to play. I think Willingham is a little bit of a sleeper at 4,900. Again, like the rest of the starters, did not play a full minute load against Valpo, but he's definitely shown the ability to hit value for a salary of 4,900, and he's getting a little bit of a price cut with it being 5,600 for the Thursday slate and 4,900 for the Friday slate. Now for Northern Iowa, Bowen Bourne is their best player. I've watched this team play a few times this season. I can say that for certainty. He's their best offensive player. He's played this season at a 26% usage rate. The problem is he's got a little AJ Storr in him. What do I mean by that? He's highly dependent on scoring, highly dependent on his shot falling. He does not record a lot of peripheral stats, which are what we need to reach fantasy point totals. So, what you're going to want if you play Bowen Bourne is a game where he's able to score it and assist it. But what you do know is that he's going to be able to score it. He's had double digit shots in 4 straight games. And earlier in the season against Belmont, he did have one solid game against them and one poor game against them, but definitely willing to go with him at a salary of only $5,900. It's not often that you get a team's usage leader at $5,900. Now, after that, Anderson, Heiss, and Hudson all have usage rates over 21%. So I'm totally okay to play them. But like, keep in mind, Titan Anderson and Nate Heiss, like they're guys that they're going to get the peripheral stats that Bowen Bourne is not getting. So if I'm playing Bowen Bourne, I'm probably not playing any of these other guys with him. Whereas if I'm playing one of these guys, I might pair two of them or pair down from one of the value plays that Northern Iowa might have, because Northern Iowa does play a deep bench. They do play 5 guys off the bench. Their fifth starter is Trey Campbell. He plays a ton of minutes, but he doesn't necessarily always have a high usage rate. But he did have a ceiling game in their last game against Southern Illinois, put up 31 fantasy points on 30 minutes played. So those are the 5 that you really want to target for Northern Iowa: is Anderson, Heiss, Bourne, Campbell, and Hudson. But they will play Henry off the bench. They will play Doe off the bench. They will play Landon Wolf off the bench. Like, this is not a team that is going to give like 6 guys 35 plus minutes like we see, a little bit earlier in the slate with teams like North Carolina A&T. All right, so that does it for the early slate. So let's take a little bit of a breather, and then let's transition on over to the night slate. Hopefully, if DraftKings has the salaries out. In an upset that rivals Fairleigh Dickinson over Purdue, FanDuel has actually beaten DraftKings out to the night slate. You go, FanDuel. That kind of impresses me. It is a little bit of a smaller slate on FanDuel. It is only a 3-game slate. We got the VCU Dayton game, the Wichita Tulane game, and the Boise State San Diego State game. I assume that DraftKings will use all 3 of these games on their slate, as well as probably add a few more. I know there's an Evansville Drake game that I expect FanDuel will have on the slate. But for the most part, we know these 3 games will be on the DraftKings slate as well. So let's go ahead and break these 3 games down, and hopefully that'll give you guys a pretty good picture of how you can build lineups for DraftKings as well as FanDuel here for this Friday night slate. So the first game on the Friday night slate is VCU heading to UD Arena to take on the Dayton Flyers, and this one is projected to be 73-64 in favor of Dayton. That's a 137-point total, which is not all that high, but it's a lot higher than the first meeting between these two teams. When they played earlier in the season in the Siegel Center, it was 49-47 in VCU, or in favor of VCU. VCU basically just had a strategy where they were going to be supremely physical on defense and basically foul on every possession and kind of just dare the refs to call it. And sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. That was kind of just their strategy. It is what it is, but it created a super ugly game. Both these teams don't play at a fast tempo anyway, so it just led to lower scoring. Now, in that first game, there were only 2 players on the entire slate on DraftKings who hit 4x value, and it was Nate Santos of Dayton and then Jason Nelson of VCU. But pretty much it's odd how that happened. Santos is kind of like a small ball 4 shooter and rebounder who got there by having a good game on the rebounding end. And then Jason Nelson, it was like catch and shoot corner threes that got him to hit value. So very weird game from fantasy environment. On the VCU side, they might be playing this game without Max Shulga. He is their point guard and floor general. He missed their most recent game against Duquesne, and it's a back injury, so I don't really know what to make of it. I don't expect him to play in this game. Nothing would shock me in college basketball, but I do not expect him to play. If he does not play, you will see increased usage out of Zeb Jackson. You will see increased usage out of Sean Barstow, and you will probably see the biggest increased usage out of Joe Bamasil. Bamasil normally comes off the bench, and he still did in that game against Duquesne, but he got all the way up to 33 minutes, had north of a 30% usage rate, and put up 23 fantasy points on FanDuel in that game. And I do believe, doing the calculations, it would have been about 25 on DraftKings. So definitely a guy that you got to be interested in if Shoga is in fact out for this game. Now, on the Dayton side of things, you got to start off everything with Deron Holmes II. He is this team's best player. He is an All-American candidate. He is just really good at basketball, quite frankly. And, in their last game against St. Louis, he put up 51 fantasy points. That is on FanDuel. I do believe it will be more than that on DraftKings because they have the double-double bonus. So just a massive ceiling on this guy. pretty high floor as well. Even in that first game against VCU, he had 31 fantasy points, and that was like the worst game environment possible. So I can't say enough about Deron Holmes. He's kind of been on these Friday slates week in and week out, and I always end up playing him, and I never really end up regretting it. And so I do think he's an elite option against this VCU team here on this slate, and I think the game environment can't be worse than it was the first time. Now, I think Holmes could also find himself in line for increased usage. Dayton's floor general, Javon Bennett, is likely going to be out for this game with a thumb injury. He injured it against Loyola in the first half and did not return in the second half, did not play against St. Louis in their most recent game. And all that did was it just led to increased usage for Deron Holmes, right? So if you're without one of your better guards, just dump it on down to your All-American big man and let him go to work. And that's kind of what they did. So that makes me like Holmes even more. Now, if I were to play somebody other than Holmes, we've talked about this, numerous times throughout this season, but Nate Santos is the guy who generally seems to get there when Holmes does not. In that game against St. Louis without Bennett, he did put up 21 fantasy points with a slightly increased usage rate. So, don't mind going to Nate Santos either, but my favorite play, with or without Bennett for Dayton at the guard spot is going to be Enoch Cheeks. So he was a 15-5 guy at Robert Morris a season ago, and he really hasn't been like a super elite scorer for Dayton this season just because they haven't really needed him to be that. He's been more of a defensive stopper, solid rebounder, solid assist guy. But now he's really starting to elevate his game as a scorer. He scored over 15 points in 3 straight. He's put up over 21 fantasy points in 3 straight. And he's at a salary on FanDuel, and I'm curious to see what he comes in at on DraftKings, that he is very affordable, and I think he is really solid. He saw a big-time boosted usage rate against St. Louis with Javon Bennett out of the lineup, and he's a guy who can take on that increased usage rate because he has done it before in his career at Robert Morris. He's my favorite guard on the Dayton side. Now, Kobe Elvis is technically second in the team in usage, but he tends to get a lot of buckets on isolation. So he doesn't really feel like a guy that you would really want to stack with a whole lot of other guys. He did kind of take over the point guard role against St. Louis and put up 5 assists en route to a 31 fantasy point performance, but he's definitely a little more high risk, high reward than the other Dayton guys. And then Kobe Bryant filled in the spot in the starting lineup in place of Javon Bennett, played 34 minutes against St. Louis, put up 30 fantasy points. He is a knockdown shooter. He is one of the best shooters in all of college basketball. And so if he gets hot from behind the arc, he's a guy who you're definitely going to want into your lineup. And then the bench guys that they played in that St. Louis game were just Isaac Jack and Brady Ewell. Isaac Jack is their backup big. If you were ever to think Holmes gets in foul trouble, he would be a guy that they would play a lot more. And then Brady Ewell is a walk-on who is actually fairly serviceable. And he ended up playing in that game a decent amount against St. Louis, and ended up actually making a three-pointer, which, for a walk-on, it's pretty good. Played 13 minutes in that game. I don't think he's really an option in DFS, but he is a guy who is going to be on the floor getting minutes. Now, the second game of the night is by far the best game environment of the night, and I think I would include this even no matter what other games on the schedule DraftKings could possibly include. This would be the best game environment Friday night. It is Wichita heading to Tulane. Ken Palm has this one projected to be 80-76 in favor of Tulane. And like I said, I just think this is an elite game environment to target. For Wichita, we have not seen them on like a DraftKings or FanDuel main slate in a while, but they've been pretty much just up to the same old, same old. Colby Rogers is their best player from a fantasy perspective. He is their usage leader on the season. He is generally pretty consistent. He will generally get you a decent amount of peripherals as well. Not a bad option. Harlan Beverly is kind of like the 1B option after Colby Rogers. He's probably a little bit more consistent than Rogers, but not as high of a ceiling. And then Xavier Bell and Kenny Poto are high usage guys who come off the bench. Tulane is not very big down low. They play super small ball. And I could see Kenny Poto, who's kind of more of a scoring big, absolutely having his way scoring down low if he's able to stay on the floor for defensive purposes. Quincy Ballard is a more slow lumbering big, not like a quick athletic type. And I think he is probably the type of guy that would get played off the floor against Tulane, but by all their spacing and all their shooters. So I would definitely go Poto over Ballard, even though Ballard is the one that is technically the starter at the center position. And then after that, Xavier Bell and Bijan Cortez both run the point, and just from a fantasy perspective, it's very hit or miss, and it's more often than not, it's a miss. I'm good passing on that situation. On the Tulane side, Kevin Cross is their best player. If you have not watched this guy play, he is the true definition of a point forward. He brings the ball up the court, and then on defense, he is usually guarding the 4 or the 5 man. It's pretty darn impressive. And what that leads to is just a ton of stats for him. He's able to get a ton of rebounds, ton of assists, and oh, by the way, he is one of their better scorers. Against a Wichita team who is not good defensively and also likes to push the pace, I really do like Kevin Cross. He's a little more expensive on FanDuel than I would have liked, because if you look at the teams he's played recently, they have really gone through the ringer of like poor game environments in their last 6 games. They played elite defensive teams like South Florida and Florida Atlantic, and then super slow teams like North Texas and ECU. So now we've got a really good game environment for him, and I was hoping we would get a little bit of a discount, and we don't, but I still think he's an elite option. Now, Colin Holloway is the traditional 5 for them, but he is not a big fella. He's only about 6'6", 220. And so Wichita has been known to get beat down low. And so he would be an option, in my opinion, for that reason. Now, when it comes to the Tulane guards, look, I can never get them right. You've got Sion James, Jalen Forbes, and Colby King, and they kind of alternate big games. They're kind of very similar profiles. Forbes has the best usage on the season. And so he's also the most prone to have big time scoring nights. So he would probably be my lean. But Sion James, it's a very similar profile. He does get a little more of the peripherals than Jalen Forbes does at a lower usage rate as a part of the actual offense, though. I never seem to get him right. And I think that if you're stacking up this game, you do want to get one of those 3 guys, but just know that it's not exactly a sure thing of a situation. Next up, we've got the last game on the FanDuel slate, which is Boise taking on San Diego State. KenPom has this game projected to be 72-66 in favor of the Aztecs, which is not a great game environment. And the last time these two teams played, Boise won 67-66, which was not a great game environment. Like, pretty much nobody hit value in the first meeting between these two teams. And so how could that be different this time? Well, on the Boise side, they've got 2 great bigs, Tyson Degenhart and Omar Stanley. Here's the problem, though. One of them has to guard Jaden Ledee of San Diego State on the other side. And Jaden Ledee is one of the best players in the nation at drawing fouls and attempting free throws. Believe it or not, 2 of the nation's 3 leaders in free throw attempts are playing on this slate. Number 1, you probably guessed it, is Zach Edey. Number 2 and number 3 are Jaden Ledee and Deron Holmes. So I really think that with the Boise side, it's going to be Omar Stanley being tasked to guard Ledee, which is going to allow Degenhart to have a little bit more of an upside. Now, if they come out in Degenhart's guarding Ledee, then I'm going to be seriously concerned for Degenhart. But I do think that Degenhart is going to have more upside if he is the guy that is not guarding Ledee. That's going to give him a little more freedom offensively as well. And then if Stanley does find himself in foul trouble, Cam Martin is the backup big. He pretty much spells whatever minutes Degenhart and Stanley do not play. So if you think that Ledee is going to draw a lot of fouls, not a bad idea to play Cam Martin on a slate like this. Especially on a FanDuel 3-game slate, you can take a few chances with a guy like Cam Martin. Now, on the rest of the Boise lineup, Chibuzu Agbo is probably their best perimeter player. I kind of like him at 5,500 on FanDuel. I'm going to be curious to see what he comes in at on DraftKings. And then Roddy Anderson is interesting. He actually attempted his season high in shot attempts in that first game against San Diego State. So whatever the reason may have been, they really went to him offensively. Now, it only resulted in 16 fantasy points, but he did take off 15 shots. And so you get a guy like this who's going to, maybe he takes 15 shots again. That's a value play that I can really get behind at $4,200 on FanDuel, and curious to see what he comes in on DraftKings. Now, on the San Diego State side, we already mentioned him by name already, but it's Jaden Ledee or bust, in my opinion. He was not super productive in that first game against Boise, only had 22 fantasy points, but the usage is just insane. He draws fouls at an incredible rate, and he can carry this team on his back. Now, between the 2 of them, personally, I would rather pay up to Deron Holmes than play Jaden Ledee. I think Holmes is more consistent. I think Holmes has a higher ceiling. I think Holmes generally is worth every penny that you're going to pay up for him. But Ledee is certainly an option, especially if you're going to fade Holmes. And honestly, maybe there's enough value on this slate that you can play both of them together. But I do really like Jaden Ledee, and I definitely am going to be getting him in some lineups. Now, after that, they've kind of been a mess all season long. We've talked about this on the podcast. You got Parrish, Butler, Trammell, and Waters, who are the primary minute getters outside of Ledee, and you just never really know which one of them's going to pop off. Like you just don't. And so they're kind of ugly plays at their salary. I would prefer to see them all a little bit cheaper. Reese Waters is the one who has been kind of slumping a little bit lately. He has not been up to his normal stuff. Only 3 fantasy points in the last game against UNLV. And then Jay Powell is a guy who will get a decent amount of minutes as well, but he hasn't been great from a fantasy perspective either. This San Diego State team is a really tough team to target for and against because really they don't have a whole lot of consistent offense outside of Jaden Ledee, and they also don't surrender a whole lot of fantasy points because of how slow they play and the elite tempo that they play at. All right, so that does it for the 3-game FanDuel slate, and that does it for our episode, y'all. So, like I said, it would not shock me if DraftKings had more games on the Friday night slate, but definitely happy to talk about those three. And those three, I know for a fact, are going to be on the DraftKings night slate. Like I'd be wanting to guarantee that. So, hopefully, gave you guys plenty of analysis that will allow you to build a successful DFS lineup, whether you are playing on DraftKings or FanDuel. And kind of happy that we got to do that from the FanDuel perspective for once. So, that does it for this episode, guys. Hopefully you're going to have a good early slate and a night slate here on Friday. We're going to be back for the Saturday episode, hopefully back for the Sunday episode as well. So, that pretty much does it for this episode. Remember, if you do want to get more from me, you can follow me on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. You can join the Fantasy Corner Discord, and you can get the articles on the Patreon. We mentioned those at the top of the show. And that pretty much does it, guys. Best of luck to you here on both of these Friday slates. Thank you guys for watching and listening to this point, and I will see you next time.